I wonder if people can hear the music. I'll put it up a little bit. Music is contemporary with half the life of our writer today. Let's see if it gets louder. We'll turn it down a little again. Lovely. Well, it's a miserable day out there. My part of Pittsburgh, anyway. But we're all lovely and cozy and sunny in here. Here we go. Hello, Art. Nice to have you back. There you are, Jill, as well. Welcome. I hope you're all sitting comfortably. I know I am. If you can hear the music, I wonder if anybody can guess the composer. We'll see. Thank you, Patty. I'm glad to be back too. Hello, Francis. Jim. I'm mentioning you all because soon it starts to get flooded and then I can't keep up with it. But anyway. Yeah, it's gone loud again. That track gets very loud. We might change the track to something a little gentler. Yes, that one. So, as I say, if anybody out there can name the composer of the music, there's no prize, just for the fun of it. Hello, James. And the only clue is that he is a contemporary of, in fact, he is a contemporary of Shaw. Yeah. He was like 8 years later being born and dying. But apart from that, he was a contemporary. Barb and Marianne, hello. No, Susan, you're wrong. It's not. And anyway, he was French. This composer is most decidedly English. He also wrote, apart from this, one of the loveliest tone poems ever for the violin. And he's one of my favorite composers. I love him. Hello, Anne. Hello, Joan. Hello again. So I'm just asking for the newcomers if anybody can guess the composer. Yes, it is Susan, isn't it? I love it. Deborah wins the non-prize. She guessed it. It is indeed Vaughan Williams. Vaughan Williams, remarkable composer. He and Delius almost defined English music in that first half of the late 19th, early 20th century. And I think one of my most favorite pieces of modern music in that sense is Vaughan Williams' The Lark Ascending. And if you haven't heard it, find it and listen to it. It is the most beautiful piece of violin music ever, where the violin literally becomes the bird in flight. It's just so exquisite. Hello, Susie. I love the name of the place, that part of Pittsburgh where you live. How nice it is to live in friendship. Yes, I agree with you, Rosemary. You cannot tire of The Lark Ascending. It's just, when you need to cheer yourself up, it's beautiful. When you're feeling down, it's beautiful. Just beautiful. I love it. Hello, Alma. Magda, hello again. Welcome from San Antonio. Lovely that you've joined us again. Hello, Nicola from Cork. Welcome back. Yes, the Adagio for strings is exquisite, I agree, but the Lark Ascending is even nicer. But I'm just prejudiced. At my age, I'm allowed to be. Welcome, William, from the shores of Seneca Lake. Far and wide we have people. I think last week we had somebody from Poland, which was good. And we have people from the UK and Ireland, obviously. I don't know why I say obviously. It's delightful that we do. Happy Friday to you, Sarah. Nice to get all these little messages. Nice to have you with us, Paul. Thank you. Hello, Hazel. And I hope you're well and safe. Ed and Andrea, I miss Osher too, but at least we're doing some classes, even if it's this way. Now, we're on time, but I think we'll give it another minute just to let a few more join us. We have a huge sign up now. We've increased our numbers dramatically, so a lot of people have to look at it, the replay. We're sorry about the replay mess last week. It wasn't us. It was the webinar software, but we've got it all sorted out, and everything is now back online, so you can watch. You can watch the last 3 programs. You'll be able to watch this. So if you have friends who do miss this, the live broadcast, you can tell them that they can tune in online and they can see it later today. Is it later today? I think it is later today, later this evening. And any of the back ones will also be there, so they can see all four of them this evening. And next week's will also go on a line as well. So, Angela, you're very welcome. Hello, Dennis. So I think we'll make a start now, and I'm going to start by winding the music down as usual, because no matter how good I am, I cannot compete with Vaughan Williams. He's just too good. I just push the stop button. I want to begin by saying thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the donations that came in last week and in fact during the course of the week. They are so important. I'm really so grateful. We at PICT are really so grateful. At times like this, and I mean, I'm going to use the word that everybody hates hearing now, in unprecedented times like this, the donations are so important. We have virtually no other way of earning money. And so every donation that those of you who come to the theater and see me do that curtain speech, no, I keep saying this, every dollar counts, every donation counts. And so we are deeply grateful for the money that you send to us. And please don't stop. We do need it. On every email on the website, you'll find the big red button. You'll find the address. Send us a check, make a direct donation. It doesn't matter what that is. Please do it, because we still have to keep the company running. And we want to be back with you either in the fall or as soon as we're permitted to. We're going to restructure the way we do plays. We're even going to restructure the way we seat people so that everybody feels comfortable and safe. But in order to do all of that, we still need your donations coming in. So there'll be more about that on another video in a week or so. But for the moment, just thank you. It's been wonderful. Now, last week we had a trivia question, and that was the name of the hotel where Oscar famously drank hock and seltzer on the night that he was arrested. And of course, the name of that was the Cadogan Hotel. And the trivia winner, Marcia Metelsky. Well done, Marcia. The event was actually not just a famous literary event in the history of Oscar, but famous because the former British poet laureate John Betjeman wrote a poem about it as well. And so there you are. There'll be another trivia question later on in today's broadcast. And today we come to the fourth of those Irish playwrights who changed the face of English theatre. Now, each of the previous ones, there's been a particular gap, and we took Shakespeare as our starting point because, to my mind, Shakespeare was the person who Shakespeare and his contemporaries, but principally Shakespeare, redefined the nature of theatre, which had been formulated by the Greeks into this notion of the comedy, the tragedy, these two fundamental forms of playwriting or plot writing. The Greeks, in a way, probably defined every plot that it was possible to write. You know, there's their old saying, there are only 7 basic plots. I've never worked out what they are. Some people say there are 5, some people say there are 12. Doesn't really matter. The fact is, the Greeks worked it all out. And so it continued for 2,000 years. And there were certain rules laid down about what you could or couldn't do. And there was a lot of bad theatre and a lot of inventive theatre and a lot of improvised theatre over that 2,000-year period until we came to the time of Shakespeare. And he really redefined how plays worked. And as I said before, this notion that before that drama was based on the Greek principle of God's in his heaven, the king's on his throne, and everything's right with the world or wrong with the world. But you had that kind of hierarchy, the gods, the kings, the people. Shakespeare turned it on its head, and so did some of his contemporaries, by making those gods less vital, less important, and making kings or dukes or princes or whatever into people. He brought out their humanity. They were no longer superior or vital because of their rank or their position or their birth, simply because of their power. And their power could be gained through nefarious means. They could be good kings, they could be bad kings, they could be intelligent kings, they could be stupid kings. But they were very, very human. We understand that today. But authority was something that you won. Authority was something that was granted to you, or in different ways than simply because your dad was a king, you became a king. You had to prove your right, and you had to earn your right, and you had to keep your right. So Shakespeare had changed all that. Since then, there was this long cycle of writing, and I believe that Irish writing and Irish playwrights had a major influence on that in the English language, up to a point that theatre changed again in a way that was as huge, as massive, as complete as it was in Shakespeare's time. And I'll be coming to that in the next discussion. But right now we're coming to the end of the cycle that I'm talking about. And we're going to talk about the other great Dublin writer of that period, George Bernard Shaw. Now, in previous talks, we've discussed the fact, that Farquhar was born 70 years after the death of Shakespeare. Sheridan was born 40 years after the death of Farquhar. Oscar was born 30 odd years after the death of Sheridan, whatever. Here we have two playwrights who are absolutely contemporary. Oscar was born in 1854. George Bernard Shaw was born in 1856. They were both from Dublin. They were from slightly different social backgrounds, whereas Wilde was the upper echelons of the intelligentsia of Dublin, living in Merrion Square, doing all that. Shaw was from what we might call the lower echelons of the middle class. He was born in Sing Street. It was a nice enough house, but not as impressive as that in which the Wildes lived. In the area of Dublin known as Portobello, it was his mother was a singer and a musician. She had a great friend. I'm not going to go into all that history because I say these classes are not history lessons. You can read all of this up, but she had a great friend who was a musician and singer as well. Shaw always believed that he was the son of that particular person. That's another story and not really relevant to this. But the important point was, Shaw was born at the same time as Wilde. He was a contemporary in terms of birth, but he died in the year 1950. Oscar died in 1900. So Shaw survived him by 50 years. Shaw lived to his 94th year. Oscar died in his 46th year. So even though they were contemporaries, there were two very different social backgrounds and social understanding. In other words, what one might say, Shaw lived in a different epoch. By the way, his name was George Bernard Shaw. He liked to be called Bernard Shaw. He didn't particularly like the name George, so he was always known as Bernard Shaw. He was quite a remarkable character. If Wilde was a character in terms of his flamboyance, Shaw was a character in terms of his eccentricity. He achieved many things. Like Wilde, he achieved many things in his life. He was a novelist, very unsuccessfully. He was a playwright, phenomenally successfully. He was a critic. He was a socialist and a political activist. You might say that he had the Dublin desire to stick his nose into everybody's business and have a much better opinion about whatever there was than anybody else did. He was nosy, he was interruptive, he was interfering, he was highly opinionated. And I've said before, I think that if he hadn't existed, James Joyce would probably have invented him as one of his perennial Dublin characters in either Dubliners or Ulysses. But anyway, he was that kind of extreme personality that came out of Dublin at that time, with a lot to say. Phenomenally intelligent. But his influence, his ultimate influence on the development of English theatre was absolutely immense, possibly more so than anybody else at that time, because he brought, we discussed last week about the way that Oscar had brought a political nuance to theatre. But for sure, he brought a new kind of politics into the theatre. And pretty much every play he wrote, in that sense, was political. But where Oscar had, as we discussed, satirized the late Victorian world in which he lived and wrote, and I mentioned the two C's of Oscar's writing, which were class and corruption. And he wrote quite brilliantly on both of those topics in each of the four major plays that he wrote. I will be discussing the fifth major play of Oscar, but not in these talks. We have to wait until I'm doing the three talks about Oscar Wilde again at the end of this series. But anyway, as I said, Oscar satirized late Victorian London, late Victorian class, late Victorian corruption, and late Victorian England was riddled with it. Shaw carried that satire through to a downright attack. It was somewhat less subtle, but equally as brilliant. Now, one must also remember that Shaw had an additional 50 years and the effect of 2 world wars in which to do his writing and to make his observations, to introduce his politics into theatre and to affect theatre. Shaw had lived, as Oscar did, in the late Victorian period, but unlike Oscar, lived on through the Edwardian world and right through to the beginnings of the modern age. He was, like Oscar, born halfway through the reign of Queen Victoria, and he died literally just before the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. He actually lived long enough to see England go from direst poverty for the poorest to the very beginnings of the welfare state that he had always agitated for, and that in fact England became famous for, and the growth of things like pensions and social security and national health system and all of that. That all came to fruition just around the time that Shaw was dying. So he saw this 180-degree change in English society and a change in the way that the world was ordered. And he had fought for that and argued for that through most of his plays and most of his writing. So when we look at Shaw, we want to look at, as Shaw the writer, as a political force, rather than Shaw the essayist, the journalist, the critic. It's through his writing that we want to examine it and how that changed English theatre and the kind of inheritance that he left behind him. Like Oscar, his capacity for words was limitless. He was, in that sense, the classic Irish talker. Oscar had said that the Irish were the greatest talkers since the Greeks, and he was probably right. And Shaw was a perfect example of that. He could talk and he could write. And I'm always astonished by those late Victorians, their capacity, the volumes that they were capable of writing without the use of word processors. Look at Dickens. They wrote these vast plays, these vast books, these wonderful essays, all by hand. It was only the later invention of the typewriter that made it slightly easier. But most of these guys, they wrote by hand. If Wilde, as he was often described, was the lord of language, Shaw was its modernizer. He, as it were, dragged the use of the English language into a modern context. His writings were relentless, and his thinking, again like Wilde, was always to be modern. They were contemporaries in thought as well as in time. They weren't the closest of friends. They knew one another. And in fact, when Wilde went through all his difficulties, Shaw was there to help and advise as much as he could. But both of them, they were always seeking to the modern, to look to the modern, what Wilde had called the fin de siècle, turn of the century, this new growth. And Shaw was there with a new politic, a new thinking. He'd moved to London in 1876. Like others, the other writers that we've discussed, they all went to London. But by this time, London was not just merely the capital of the United Kingdom, it was virtually the capital of the world. It was what New York would eventually become. It was the center of the world. The British Empire was growing and growing and growing, and the world looked to London. That's where banking became well, it's the center of the world. Once got there, he began the writing career, and like many others at the time, he started by trying to be a novelist. Now, he was not successful. He wrote a couple, I think, of novels in the what was then most popular format, the 3-volume novel, which was very hard to accomplish because you had to make the plot last over 3 volumes. He failed. His novels have not gone down as some of the greatest literature, whereas his plays most definitely have. It would be quite some years before he became a success as a playwright. But what helped him in this, and this is deeply important to his writing, what helped him is that he, around that time, slightly later, 1884, there was founded in London a terribly important society whose influence has reached out over British political thinking across the world. This group founded the London School of Economics, a whole new economic theory based on their philosophies, and that was the Fabian Society. And it was the thinking that came from that society and to which he contributed that an awful lot of his political thinking within his writing really began to formulate. And one of the things that's always been leveled about that is that it was influenced by Marx. Yes, it was influenced by Marx. Karl Marx had 20 years earlier, I think, published the Communist Manifesto. It was working on Das Kapital, but where Marx and Engels were moving towards what became known as communism, the Fabian Society were fundamentally liberal. They were a society based on liberal thinking. In fact, their very purpose, I can actually quote it for you. I'm going to read it to you here. The sort of the mission statement of the Fabian Society, when founded and still to this day, to promote greater equality of power, wealth, and opportunity, the value of collective action and public service, an accountable, tolerant, and active democracy, citizenship, liberty, and human rights, sustainable development, and multilateral international cooperation. And I might say that's not a million miles away from the opening declarations of the United States Constitution. This was a liberal agenda, and the idea that in a world that had become or was becoming corrupt, as Oscar had pointed out, where wealth and power were becoming almost a precondition of society, the Fabians wanted quietly, gently, without revolution, but by influence and by argument, to demonstrate that there was a better way, and that was a way of through society. And Shaw was deeply engaged with that. He was, I suppose, he was in fact, I suppose, as were the Fabians, he was the Bernie Sanders of his day. He was a democratic socialist, following the liberal agenda of we are, as society, responsible for each other. That was the basic principle by which he thought. He made another very important discovery at this time as well. He discovered Henrik Ibsen. Ibsen, the playwright from Scandinavia, the man from the deep north. And Ibsen had a huge influence on both Shaw's thinking and writing. He was almost the advocate for Ibsen. And Ibsen was considered a shocking writer because of the major topic he dealt with. And that was particularly the role of women in society and in politics. Ibsen had that strange influence on these two particularly remarkable Irish writers, both Wilde and Shaw, but particularly Shaw. If you look at the plays of Ibsen, always the woman is the center point. The woman is the center of the plot. She is the guiding light through the play. And the choices she makes. Shaw actually wrote a rather lovely little book or series of essays called The Quintessence of Ibsenism. And if you can find it, give it a read. It's really good. But the argument, that in Ibsen, Nora in A Doll's House does the unthinkable. She leaves her husband. In Ghosts, a woman has done the unthinkable. She has stayed with the husband, and the result of that is that he passed on through her womb congenital syphilis to her son. These were plays at the time that were shocking. And Shaw grasped at it. So if you look at it, both Wilde and Shaw recognized that the world, as Ibsen had indicated, the world was to be a much better place. If the world was to be a much better place, then women had to be a part of it, if not leaders in that. They would, the emancipation of women would generate the essential change that society needed in order to mature and grow and move into the modern world. And remember, at that time, you also had the suffragette movement in England, looking for that basic right to vote, a fundamental human right in any democracy, the right to vote. So this influence, this deep influence of Ibsen passed through to Shaw as well. And if you look at the list of his plays, how many of them are about or centered around women? If you look, Candida, Pygmalion, Major Barbara, Caesar and Cleopatra, St. Joan, Heartbreak House. Women dominate the plot, or else they resolve the plot. It is women are not merely the reason for the play, but they are very often the resolution of the play, the resolution of the story, of the problems that have been placed forward, the social issues. The solution very often is women. So you have this influence of Ibsen. You have this influence of the Fabian society, this need for a more liberal agenda in a world that is dominated still by power and class and corruption. So now there are so many of his plays that one could you could choose any of his plays almost to examine in depth this particular influence, and not only the socioeconomic influence, but the influence he had on English playwrights. But what I want to do is I'm going to concentrate on one play in particular, and it's one of his lesser known plays. I'm always astonished at how many people say, "What?" when I mention the name of the play, and so they've never heard of it. It is very much a lesser known play, but it is a remarkable piece. It's a remarkable play, and it's called The Apple Cart. The apple cart of the title is from the notion that when one wants to cause change, one tends to have to upset the apple cart. And this is about causing change. But it's also about something much deeper. And when you look at any of Shaw's plays, it's very advisable, if you can, to have a particular volume beside you when you're reading the play. And this is the volume, The Prefaces by George Bernard Shaw, or by Bernard Shaw. I've had this one so many years now, and even when I got it, it was an old copy, but it's quite remarkable. Get hold of The Prefaces by Shaw. If you want to really know anything about Shaw, these are what you have to read. Now, many of the plays that he wrote had these polemic prefaces. And through them, you really can begin to glean the original thought that produced the play and the policy that the play is expounding. Shaw did not just sit down and say, "Oh, I've got an idea. I'm going to write a play about a flower girl." No. Pygmalion, for instance, was based on a true story. But he wanted to make a particular social point, and he wasn't a priest, so he couldn't stand in a pulpit, so he wrote a play. One of the things he writes, actually, quite near the beginning of that book, it is never safe to take my plays at their suburban face value. It ends in your finding in them only what you bring to them, and so getting nothing for your money. Now, he was very determined about this point, because we have a tendency when we look at art of any kind to see what we want to see. Now, you can look at a painting, for instance, and in that painting you can see the subject, you can see the picture. That's very often not why the painter painted the painting, because the painter was painting something thematic. He had something to say. It is not simply a face. If you look at Rembrandt, he painted his own face so many times, but he wasn't painting his own face. He was painting the process of aging. He was saying something about himself. He was saying something about humanity, about the human condition. So each of these prefaces will give you a kind of perspective into where Shaw came from to write the play. In the apple cart is a very strong case in point, because the play is about democracy. Here, another quote: "Democracy, as you know it, is seldom more than a long word beginning with a capital letter." It's one of those words we use. We throw it about. We bandy it about. Democracy, democracy, democracy. We live in a democracy. Oh, it's a democracy. Without actually ever examining what that truly means. And even when some of us, the most intelligent, do try to examine it, it very often doesn't mean what we think it does. The plot of the play of The Apple Cart's really quite simple. He wrote it set in the future. So the future he chose was 1962. It's a bit like Blade Runner was set in 1982 or something. It's very difficult to set something in the future because we tend to live beyond it. But anyway, he set it in the future of 1962 about a king of England called King Magnus. King Magnus was a very modern person, and so much so that he was trying to influence the way the country was governed. Now, for those of you, most of you know, England or Britain is a constitutional monarchy. In other words, there is still a king or queen, as there is at the moment, but they have no real power. Somebody once defined it that a constitutional monarch has two things: the right to be consulted and the right to advise. After that, there is no power. If a bill from Parliament is put in front of them, they have to sign it. But this king was ruling a country that was not being well governed as far as he was concerned, even though it was democratic. There was a government, there was a prime minister, they were all elected, there was a parliament, but he did not like the way the country was being run. So using influence, but gently but effectively, he was trying to interfere. So the government come to him and say, "You've got to sign this ultimatum, you've got to promise not to make any more speeches." And the king says, "Well, you, the government, write my speeches." And the prime minister says, "Yes, but you have a way of looking when you unscroll the manuscript." So in other words, the king is using cynicism to try to overcome the government. So they give him an ultimatum that he has never to make another speech of any kind or any form, and he has to sign it. And so he says, "Well, I have to think about this. I have to think about this." So he goes off and he has a think, and he talks to his wife, and he talks to his mistress because it's modern. And then in the final scene, he comes back to talk to the government, and he says to the government, "I can't sign this ultimatum, so I have decided to abdicate. I'm going to leave the throne." And they're all overjoyed, the whole government jumping up and down and singing songs. And so he's really thrilled, or they're really thrilled, but the prime minister says, hang on a minute, what do you mean?" And the king says, "Well, I'm going to abdicate, but when I abdicate, I'm going to renounce all my titles, all my ranks, all my positions. I'm going to become a common man, an ordinary member of society. And I will, of course, dissolve Parliament as my prerogative before I abdicate. And that means there'll have to be an election, and I will put myself forward as a member of parliament for the Royal Borough of Windsor, and I have no doubt I'll be elected, and my son, who will have become king on my abdication, will no doubt invite a member of parliament to form a government, and I'm sure that I will be able to rally enough support for me that I will become the next prime minister, and the current prime minister takes the ultimatum and tears it up. Because it is this realization that government and democracy are is a risky business. Shaw makes a point about democracy. Now remember, this man was a liberal Democrat. This man believed in liberal, free, democratic government. He makes this point. I'm quoting again because nobody can put it better than he did. If I say that the sea is sometimes furiously violent and always uncertain, and that those most familiar with it trust it least, you will not immediately shriek out that I do not believe in the sea, that I am an enemy of the sea, that I want to abolish the sea and make sea bathing illegal. The same is true of democracy, and he goes on to make the point that sometimes democracy, in fact, very often, democracy is furiously violent and always uncertain, and that those most familiar with it trust it least. And anybody who has followed politics in any country that is democratically operated will recognize that fact. You cannot assume anything in a democratic process. He goes on to talk about possibly the most famous statement made about democracy and its definition. I'm quoting again. Abraham Lincoln declared at Gettysburg that the slaughter of Americans by Americans occurred in order that democracy, which is defined as government of the people, for the people, by the people, should not perish. Now, he then says, let's unpick that. Government of the people is necessary. A community, any human community, cannot exist without some form of government. You can do it on your own, but if you're a community, you need some form of government. Government of the people. Government for the people is also most important. I'm quoting Shaw here. Because such a principle demands equal consideration for all the people who are governed. In other words, in a democracy, everybody is considered equally. Not considered equal, but considered equally. But government by the people is the problem. We repudiate number 3 on the grounds that the people cannot govern. Every citizen cannot be a ruler any more than every boy can be an engine driver or a pirate king. Shaw is not attacking democracy. He's attacking the way that it's operated. He is attacking the absurd simplicity that we bring to that word. That if government of and for the people is necessary, then, well, somebody has to do it. And the people who choose who does it, who choose who governs them, that is the democratic principle. Even if it's a king or a parliament or a dictator, if the people make that choice, then that is democracy in a nutshell. But he goes on, because he then asks the question, who does govern us? And he introduces a theme which he calls Breakages Limited, or as we might say here, Breakages Inc. And Breakages Inc., Breakages Limited, is the great industrial plutocracy. Business. Business which subordinates democratic government to the extent that even socialist politicians, as I'm quoting him again, no longer dare even to talk of nationalizing any industry, such as, for instance, healthcare. Anything that can return profit for the plutocrats or attract subsidies for them, the plutocrats Breakages Limited will protect to their last dying breath. And he goes on, not until Breakages itself is broken will it cease to have a message for us. We are governed, he says, no longer by aristocracy, but by power. We are governed by those who make money. And why does he call it breakages? It's very interesting. This is just an example of the way his mind is working, how he is looking and creating plays. What is Breakages? Breakages Limited is the industry that depends on redundancy, on things falling apart. And what we have here is the early prediction of the kind of redundancy. Some of you who may have been looking at Facebook have noticed that I got a new washing machine. I got a new washing machine because the engine, the motor had broken. And the guy who came to look at it said, "Oh, well, you must have got 9 or 10 years out of that." And I said, "Well, when I was young, a washing machine would last 30 odd years." And he said, "Yes, that's why they stopped making them that way, because there is no profit in that. We want, as an industry, we want things to break down. All those commercials that say, oh, this is great, this is wonderful, and it will last you a lifetime. And the lifetime guarantee is 5 years. If something is not falling apart after 5 years, look at your cell phone. You know, after 2 or 3 years, the battery starts to go. But you can't get the battery out and change it. You have to get a new one. This is the world of Breakages Limited. The world also of the new improved, the encouragement when you've got something perfectly adequate to buy the new version of it because it's being improved. There's an old gag in the advertising industry. If something is new and improved, if it's new, from what has it been improved? But we do it all the time. We get a new cell phone simply because the new version is out. Apple has built an industry on getting people to buy the new improved. Shaw predicted all of this. Shaw understood that this was the direction in which the world was going. This was the direction in which society was going. So in his plays is this perpetual, gentle, but firm nudge in the direction of we need to care for each other. We need to stop voting in such a way that those who make profit out of our labor do not decide the rules of our labor. We need to be able to have a government that cares for us before it cares for major industry. He was a socialist. And that's not a bad thing. Sorry, nailing my colors to the mast. It is, and I've said this before, it's a strange but weird truth that the world economy right now is suffering because people are only buying what they need rather than buying what they are told they must have. This is the world of breakages, and this is what Shaw was very, very clearly writing against. The simple truth that Shaw was trying to expound was that big business denies government by the people. Very big business will end up being, by their monopoly, the true governors of the people by virtue of the people's willingness to be governed. Government of the people is necessary. Government for the people is desirable. And because we want that, they will allow government through plutocracy. And we've got to recognize, Shaw wants us to recognize that they don't govern for the people, they govern for the profit. And I think this all sounds horribly familiar. But Shaw was something of a prophet. He did understand the way the world worked. And he understood because, remember, as I said earlier, London was the center not only of the UK, it was the center of the world. London was the greatest business center at the head of the greatest business empire that the world had known since the time of the Roman emperors. London controlled all across the globe. It controlled India, much of China, a lot of the Americas, a lot of Australasia, all of that. England, more so than England, London controlled the world. The power that they had, the wealth that they had, this tiny island and this relatively small city in this tiny island ruled the world. And that's a dangerous thing. It is always a danger when you have that one center of power. Shaw understood that and wanted it changed. And one of the major factors that he knew in the change of that was women. That's why he advocated not merely a change in the political system, but a sea change, a huge change, an understanding of the dangers of democracy and how we need to use it and guard it and be careful of it and be wary of it. So, to sum that up, basically, it was an awareness on Shaw's part. And you can see it in other of his plays, because even when he writes about families, you look at Misalliance, if you look at Major Barbara, they are just simply the world brought from macrocosm to microcosm. It is the same issue being dealt with, always. There are other writers of that period doing very similar things, but Shaw manages to do it really quite perfectly. The businessmen in Shaw's plays are always demonstrations, and I'm not saying all businessmen are evil. There are wonderful people running businesses with great generosity and great understanding. But the general rule is that if a company is being run, it is being run for profit before people. And that's Shaw's major point. The dangers of democracy is that we get a government by our own willingness to leave it to others. Nowadays, for instance, if you're politically active and if you're certainly if you're opposed to government anywhere, you're considered to be lunatic fringe. You are considered to be somehow crazy. So, sorry about that. There's a phone going on. I meant to switch it off. Forgive me. Anyway, Shaw realized that the theatre, which at the time was the most immediate educative entertainment, rather like TV or movies today, theatre was the tool to demonstrate that ideas could change society, that leaders, political, industrial, were men, and in most cases, they were self-inflated balloons that could be popped. Just as Shakespeare had demonstrated that kings were just men and were subject to human frailty, Shaw wanted to demonstrate that so were business people, so were men of power, men of rank, men of industrial strength. If society, as they had, he recognized, as Oscar did, that society was in fact a fraud. That, and as Shaw put it, even a flower girl could pass for a princess if properly trained in the niceties of pronunciation, power, and proper behavior. Shaw demonstrated that anybody could be anything they wanted if they just worked at it. Shaw was quite a remarkable man. He lived a very long life, not just in years, but in output. His brain was so active for so long. He was still producing remarkable and very political pieces of writing right into his old age. But not only that, he also, I was just saying about, a flower girl becoming a princess. He redefined the way English is spoken. He created a phonetic alphabet. He wanted to actually change the alphabet for the English language. They wouldn't let him do that. He actually changed the way he was actually he was on the commission. In fact, I think he headed the commission, charged to formulate the correct spoken English by the almighty British Broadcasting Corporation. And what we now call RP, we used to be called BBC English. And such a thing was created to a large extent. I talked about Oscar Wilde creating the stage Englishman. Shaw helped to create the appropriate way that English should be spoken. And that's the way I was trained to speak it as an actor. I don't speak it like that in normal life. But anyway, he was against religion, particularly organized religion. He was not a religious person. but he was against it in principle because organized religion, he felt, was operated pretty much the way that organized industry was operated. He was a vegetarian. He was a pacifist. But he was a pacifist in the sense that in any war, and remember, he lived through two wars. He lived through the First and the Second World Wars and the Boer War. He sort of believed that in any war, both sides were usually fighting for the wrong thing, that they weren't fighting for king and country, they were fighting for industrial power, or they were fighting for more arms sales, or they were fighting for better access to oil, or in some cases coal or agriculture or whatever. The reason for a war, as far as he was concerned, had very little to do with either democracy or national honor. It was always the wrong reason for anyone to go out and die. By the way, on that final, to sort of getting to the point of summing up, because we have a few questions coming in, there are other little oddities about him. For instance, Bernard Shaw was the only person ever to win the Nobel Prize and an Oscar. He got the Nobel Prize for Literature, one of 4 Irishmen to succeed in doing that, and he also got an Oscar for the Best Adapted Screenplay, which was for the original movie of his play Pygmalion. And his writings, because he lived so long and wrote so much, have probably drawn more criticism and more books of commentary than any other writer. Somebody actually sent in an email looking, could you recommend a good biography of Shaw? Well, the best one, I think, is 18 volumes long. I have 4 of them. There are more books written about Shaw than you could possibly wish. Any biography will give you all the basic details. And I do recommend writing, but the one book I do recommend you get, Prefaces by Shaw, because you'll learn more about his thinking from that book than you will from anything else. He is generally rated amongst British dramatists second only to Shakespeare, which for an Irishman is not bad. A few small details, and then I'll do a few questions. He really did have, the whole purpose of this is what was the influence that the Irish writers had on English theatre. Well, Shaw had a huge influence on the next generations of English playwrights, and in particular those that back in the 60s were known as the Angry Young Men group. If we could say that Oscar Wilde's inheritors were English writers like Noel Coward and Terence Rattigan, and eventually Joe Orton and Alan Ayckbourn, and some people raise their eyebrows when I say that Joe Orton was a natural inheritor from Oscar Wilde, but he certainly was. From Shaw, the influences must be those angry young men, those young writers, and they were men, but writers such as Harold Pinter, John Osborne, Arnold Wesker, who wrote about the politics of the human condition. They inherited very much from Shaw, to my mind. The Oxford English Dictionary has very few words representing style and content which are derived from writers' names. There is Shakespearean, there is Pintoresque from Harold Pinter, and there is Shavian from Shaw. So next week, we're going to take a look at another one of those, Irish writer, a remarkable Irish writer whose thoughts and philosophies has spawned another term, Beckettian. That's for next week. So, have we got some questions? Yes, we have. I'm looking at them here. Were Shaw and Mark Twain acquainted? Have an influence on each other? Do you know something? I'm not sure about that. I think they must have been. I think they must have been aware of one another. Shaw was a voracious letter writer, as was Twain. So I suspect that they must have been. And to be honest, I'm sure I've read that somewhere, but I can't remember because I've read too many things. But I'd be very surprised if that wasn't true. Now, here's the thing. Yes, how much influence did the Fabian Society's interest in eugenics influence or affect Shaw's writing? Shaw did. One of the things that I consider was a mistake on his part, but everybody to his own. I think the whole notion of eugenics is wrong, and what it led to especially in Nazi Germany, was an abomination on the face of humanity. But at one point, eugenics was considered a legitimate science. Sweden was very much behind the whole concept of it. The Fabians, I think what their concern was how to improve, how to get stupidity out of the world. And I'm afraid you can't, unless you go around killing people. Some people will be stupid. Some people will pride themselves in ignorance. And some people will be born intellectually less capable. And that is a physical problem. That is a genetic problem. But you don't solve that by killing people. You solve that in other ways. And society must learn to embrace those less able. So yes, I think it did. I don't think it affected his writing hugely, to answer the question. Certainly the Fabian Society philosophy of social awareness and social responsibility, absolutely. That liberal agenda absolutely influenced him. But I don't think eugenics, I can't see anywhere in his writing that I know of, and I'm not as authoritative on his writing as I might be on Oscar Wilde's, but I don't think it had a profound effect. Did Shaw and the Fabian Society have much international influence, or was it limited to England and the UK? Well, there's a good question. I think Fabianism, it certainly had a huge influence in the United Kingdom. And now out of it, the growth and development of the Labour Party, that whole move towards social awareness after the Second World War, the Labour government that came in, the Beveridge Report that produced the welfare state, that produced the National Health Service that they're still rightly so proud of, and upon which so many others have been based. Almost every Western nation now has a National Health Service and the right guaranteed by government to health care. I can only think of one major Western power that hasn't really grasped that idea yet, but I'm not going to go into that now. But I think Fabian thinking, and he influenced it as well, because once he joined it, being George Bernard Shaw, he didn't just sit and listen, he talked as well. So when you start reading his pamphlets and his essays, you see how much he influenced the thinking in that direction. And he had a huge voice in the sense of the way he influenced society. Here's a good one. Did Shaw support the Nazis in World War II? No, he didn't support the Nazis in World War II, and he didn't support either side in World War I. He was a pacifist. Now, whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, I am not going to enter into the debate of. I fundamentally, myself, believe that we have no right to go and kill somebody. But if we have to defend ourselves as a nation, we sometimes have the obligation. If we have to defend ourselves as individuals, that is a choice we make. But Shaw, I think, would have adhered to the principle that if you have the right to defend yourself, you do not necessarily have the right to kill me in the process of doing so. He went that very complex middle road, that very complex to sum up what I was saying earlier about him, democracy, in a sense, is the hardest form of government there is because it's so difficult to define. And it's the easiest form of government to lose. You have to tread a gentle, careful middle course. And what we very often need, what we want and very often need, are politicians and leaders who will come down definitely on one particular side. But once we let them do that, that becomes dangerous. I do not believe that Shaw would have supported the Nazis, and I don't think he did, because their absolutism and their belief in a divine leader would have gone against absolutely everything that Shaw would have believed in. The fact that he was an Irishman was irrelevant. He was not an Irish nationalist. In fact, if anything, Oscar Wilde was more of a nationalist than Shaw was. But he wasn't an empire loyalist either. He was just a human being, and but one with a tremendous and phenomenal and voracious imagination. looking at other things. Did he have a long marriage in addition to? Yes, he did actually. He lived with his wife for quite a long time. There are all sorts of rumors about was he a virgin or wasn't he a virgin. Rumor has it that he wasn't particularly interested in sex, but he was a vegetarian. But they did have a long marriage. He also had a wonderful and long relationship with Mrs. Patrick Campbell, who was, in fact, the original Eliza Doolittle. But his relationships were more intellectual than, shall we say, carnal. There we are. We have a note. Shaw met Mark Twain. Thank you, Joan. In England, June 17th, 1907. There you are. I knew he had. I couldn't remember when. If or when. There's a few notes coming in on that. Any other questions? Anybody got any more questions on that? I think the important point that I can give you in terms of Shaw, as I say, his influence over English writing was absolute. He became, because he had the time to do it, because he lived till he was 94, and where Oscar only had about 20 years to do it, Shaw had nearly 70. His influence was absolute because he engaged in political debate, because he didn't simply write plays for entertainment that would go out of fashion almost immediately. He wrote plays that were political. And if you look at Pygmalion, you look at My Fair Lady and you think, oh, what a lovely musical with nice songs. And, wouldn't it be lovely and all of that. But if you look at the text of My Fair Lady, it is almost identical to the text of Pygmalion. They couldn't make it better. And if you read the play Pygmalion, you realize that the arguments of Henry Higgins and Pickering are that anybody can be anything they want, provided they learn the methodology to do that. Which means you can learn to be a dictator. You can learn to be a hermit. You can learn to be anything you want. You can be anything you want in this world. It is not designated by where you're born, who your father or your mother was. You can become a princess. I mean, I did. I think, yes, Penn, that's a good question. I think, in fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised. Yes, I think that Shaw did influence the Fabians more than they influenced him. But the important point was that Fabian thinking grounded his own, shall we say, his own liberal agenda, his own thoughts about the way the world should work. Everybody needs mentorship in their initial thinking. We all do. But from that, you grow. It's that old principle, I think I said before, Einstein. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We become giants ourselves, and above us, the next generation, the next group of thinkers grow bigger because they've had the advantage of our mistakes, of seeing our mistakes and moving on from them, as we saw the mistakes of others and moved on from them. So I suspect Shaw did have a huge influence on Fabian thinking, but it was Fabian thinking that influenced Shaw to get there. It's a steady process. It's not easy. There is no 1, 2, 3, and there you are. It's a process of listening, learning, considering, reconsidering, reevaluating, developing new thought, developing old thought. It's that kind of process. For instance, we want to talk about war and taking sides, and women at the center of everything. For instance, you could take a look at St. Joan. As far as the English at that period were concerned, St. Joan was a prostitute. I mean, Shakespeare wrote her as a prostitute, and a troublemaker, and an insurgent, and a terrorist. The French looked upon her as a heroine and made her a saint. It's that simple principle that one man. I mean, there was a prime minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, who the English had earmarked as a terrorist for years, and indeed he was. but he was also a freedom fighter and a hero and became Prime Minister of Israel. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It depends on whose side you're on. Shakespeare wrote her as evil, as a whore, as a terrorist, because Shakespeare was dealing with English history. And English history at that time was a tricky thing, because even at the reign of Elizabeth, the Tudor dynasty was a relatively new thing. When Shaw wrote his play, he did something much more clever. He recognized her sainthood, but made her phenomenally human. Why did the characters in the play follow her? Because he made her so unlikely. He made her a simple country girl. He even made her talk with a simple country accent. And his construct around Joan was to examine nationalism. And he even uses it in the play. The word nationalism that didn't exist at the time of Joan, but he has two characters discussing the fact that Joan is fighting for something that they never understood before, the notion of a nation. Whereas in the feudal period, there weren't nations, there were principalities, there was a king, but it was the dukes and the lords and everybody controlled everything. One did not love one's nation, one loved one's immediate lord. That was it, and you worked for them. But as Shaw wrote it, suddenly there's this new thing coming called nationalism. He was beginning to discuss and examine why one person's terrorist is another person's saint, and what that sainthood comes from, and why it comes, and why we believe in it. Why did they want Joan? At the end of the play, he has this wonderful epilogue where everybody who goes on and on about how wonderful she was and what a saint she was, and she says to each of them in this wonderful dream sequence, well, why don't I come back? And they all go, no, not yet, no, not really suitable, no, another day, no, not really a good plan. We don't want our saints to exist. We want them to go. So Shaw, I think, in that play is a wonderful play. It is an amazing play. And all the political arguments in that play are superb. It's about nationhood, it's about war, it's about sainthood, it's about heroes, it's about villains, and it's about how we usually, generally, are better off if our heroes are burnt and our villains get on with governing. Wonderful, wonderful satire. Okay, we're coming to the end, so I have to wrap up. Now, the first thing, oh yes, we have a trivia question. I just actually mentioned the play St. Joan. The trivia question this week is, who was on stage the original St. Joan in Shaw's play of that name? Name the actress. That is the trivia question for this week. And as usual, whose name comes first out of the hat or the computer, whatever, will get tickets for our next production as soon as we can do one. The other thing to say is thank you all for being with me. I love you all. You're wonderful that you sit through these. I'm so happy. Please, 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 please do not forget, every dollar counts. So if you go online, if you're on our website, if you get an email from us with a little big red button at the bottom, please press it. Whatever you can send seriously, seriously matters. Next week, we are going to be looking at Samuel Beckett, and who is the fifth of our writers. And there's a significance to the fact that George Bernard Shaw died in 1950, and Beckett's first major stage play was first staged in 1950. So we've got that linear thing completing itself. So as I say, next week is Samuel Beckett, and then hopefully the week after that, or possibly 2 weeks after that, we're going to begin a series of 3 discussion groups on Wilde, which we've had by popular demand, and I'm quite delighted to do. And that's all for this week. We'll see you in a week's time. Thank you for being there. Take care. Wash your hands. You can never wash them enough. And stay home safe. Bye now.